Hello, and welcome to Chronicles of the Doomed. Now, this was originally envisioned as a story about Socrates and the man's life. However, I found as I was writing it that anytime I wanted to talk about Socrates and things that were going on with him, I would have to delve into the history of Athens. So rather than go back and forth between the big picture of Athenian politics in the 400s and 300s BCE back to Socrates' ideas, I figured it would be easier to split the episodes, one dealing with Athens and its rise and fall, and the other one dealing with Socrates the man. So today we're going to try to understand the society that spawned someone like Socrates. It's been said that the past is a different country, so if I can, let me try and take you back to Greece, as it was in the 5th century BCE. Unfortunately for us, there really was no Greece in the 5th century BCE, at least not in the sense that a modern person would understand it. There wasn't like an organized, unified state with one capital and one ruler. If you were a Greek in this time period, you probably lived in what's called a polis. Now, a polis, or a city-state, was the default political system that most Greeks of this period lived in. The polis consisted of a central city and its surrounding countryside. It is also where we get the term politics from. Now, a Greek at this time would much more likely identify themselves as a citizen of Athens or Corinth or Sparta than as a member of Greece as a whole. Now, even though the Greeks were politically independent, they were united by a common language with several different dialects, the works of Homer, their religion, and certain customs, like the Olympic Games and the Oracle at Delphi. In this way, the society was kind of similar to Renaissance Italy in Caterina Sforza's day, a region with a common culture ruled by a bunch of mutually antagonistic city-states. Now, the Greek polis that will be the center of today's discussion is obviously Socrates' home of Athens. Now, out of all the Greek city-states in this time period, we know the most about Athens from everything they wrote down. Athens was a democracy. However, it would be a mistake to think that just because they were a democracy means they're something similar to the political system we have today. In fact, a modern person would probably find themselves more at home in the Persian Empire than in Athens. Now, the Athenian democracy was direct. Rather than just voting for this or that representative, an Athenian citizen could also vote on whether or not Athens went to war. And if the citizens did vote to go to war, it was likely that they would be the ones doing the fighting. Government positions in Athens, except for the most important financial and military posts, were drawn by lot, so effectively every citizen was at least a potential member of the government, as well as a member of the army. In Athens at this time, every citizen performed a number of roles, and every citizen had an active part in the course of his society. I say his because the Athenians had a limited citizenship, one that excluded women, slaves, and foreigners. Again, Athenian democracy was in many ways different from our own modern system. Even so, considering the times in which they lived, their limited democracy was revolutionary by the standards of the day. Now, Athens rose to prominence during the Persian Wars. If you've watched 300, then you have a general, if horribly inaccurate, view of the events in question. In short, the Persians invaded the Greek mainland, opposed by a coalition of Greek city-states, led by Athens and Sparta. This was the first time that the Greeks found themselves united by a common enemy. It was also the beginning of Athens' prominence in the Greek world. In the year 478, the Athenians won a major naval victory against the Persians at Salamis, and the Persians were soon expelled from the Greek mainland. It's this period, from the victory at Salamis to the end of the century, that is sometimes referred to as the Golden Age of Athens. Athens began the century with a lot of promise. They had a democratic government and a willingness to act in solidarity with the other Greek city-states to defend them against Persian imperialism. After expelling the Persians, however, the Athenians formed a league of mutual defense with other Greek city-states. It was called the Delian League after the holy island of Delos that housed the league's common treasury. The purpose of the league, at least initially, was to free the Greek city-states from the Persian Empire. And it was initially successful in its aims. It liberated the cities of Ionia from Persian rule. However, as time passed, cities of the league found themselves somewhat less than free. To be a member, you had to either pledge ships or money to the treasury. Before long, however, membership in the league ceased to be voluntary. After all, the Athenians weren't really interested in protecting you if you weren't going to pay them. As the years went on, the Delian League could probably be more accurately called an Athenian Empire. The treasury was moved to Athens, ostensibly because it would be safer there than in Delos, and the money that flowed into the league's treasury went to beautify Athens. The Parthenon that stands in the Acropolis to this day was constructed using funds from the league. The leader of Athens around this time was Pericles. Under his leadership, Athens produced the Parthenon, as well as the long walls that protected Athens and its port at Piraeus. The Athenians knew that they were weak on land, but if they could defend the walls, they would always be resupplied from the sea. Pericles put forward a defense of Athenian society and what its people stood for, which is handed down to us by the historian Thucydides. Quote, "If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. If to social standing, advancement in public life falls to reputation for capacity, class considerations not being allowed to interfere with merit. Nor again does poverty bar the way. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition." End quote. However, many of the other Greek city-states weren't as convinced of Athens' greatness. They saw a hostile power on their doorstep, no less so for being a democratic one. Fearful of Athens' growing power, rival city-states began to ally themselves with Sparta. Now, the Spartans were a vastly different people from the Athenians in many ways. Their society was organized around its military. It was the only Greek polis with a standing army made up of professional soldiers. Now, something that comes to mind when I talk about the Spartans is a quote that was applied later to the Prussians. Now, most states are countries that have armies. Prussia, at the time, was an army that had a country. You could probably say the same thing of Sparta. Now, this army was made up of the Spartiates, the Spartan citizens, or equals. They lived together in a barracks with their fellow warriors, sleeping and eating communally. Weak or sick Spartan children were euthanized if it was believed they couldn't serve the state. Spartans were trained to live meager lives, and the term Spartan today is used to refer to somebody who lives extremely simply. While the Spartiates fought, the lower class of Helots worked the land for them. Spartan society as a whole lived in fear of a rebellion by this mistreated underclass. Sparta had been for years the great power of Greece due to the professionalism and skill of their military. However, the rise of Athens threatened all of that. The two states were opposed on nearly every issue. The Spartans had a kind of oligarchic monarchy, while Athens was democratic. The Spartans lived extremely regimented lives, while the Athenians valued their liberty. Sparta didn't use gold or silver, while Athens' entire existence was based on trade. And what will be increasingly important, Sparta was a great land power, while Athens possessed the finest navy in the Greek world. In 431 BCE, the Greek city-states of Corcyra and Corinth went to war and eventually dragged both Athens and Sparta into the conflict with them. I think of this as being similar to the First World War, where a relatively minor incident led to the entire world being dragged into conflict. And so it was with the Peloponnesian War. As the war started, the Spartans made their first move by invading the region around Athens, known as Attica. The farmers and rural folks fled to Athens, seeking protection under the walls. While the Spartans couldn't storm Athens' defenses, the cramped and dirty environment as well as the high volume of trade from overseas left the Athenians vulnerable to an even more deadly enemy: plague. We don't know for sure what disease caused the plague of Athens, but the symptoms included fever, coughing, and eventually diarrhea. Thucydides writes, quote, "The catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen next to them, became indifferent to every rule of religion or law," unquote. Athenian society was at the breaking point, and all order seemed to have collapsed as the disease killed indiscriminately. Even the great statesman and leader of Athens, Pericles, eventually succumbed to the disease. It is estimated that the disease killed a quarter of the Athenian people. It's a wonder that the Athenians were able to continue the war at all after such a disaster. Though the Athenians fought on, they never again had a leader to match Pericles. Instead, the ones that followed were a succession of demagogues. While Pericles had preferred to fight the war on Athens' strengths, namely its navy, those who followed opted for more brash measures to break the stalemate and defeat Sparta. Throughout the course of the war, Athens was actually able to inflict some pretty serious defeats on Spartans. In 425, they even captured 120 Spartan warriors, which was a rare feat considering that the Spartans were supposed to never surrender. However, despite holding the advantage over the Spartans, the Athenians continued to prosecute the war, preferring a total victory over a negotiated peace that would have left them in control over huge swaths of territory. The Athenians, as well as their Spartan enemies, became more and more brutal as the war progressed. Given that Athens is a democracy, it's perhaps tempting to view them as the good guys, the philosophers and the humanitarians, right? Well, every time I get that urge, I think back to the Melian dialogue. The Melian dialogue, like much of this story, comes to us from the historian Thucydides, who wrote a history of the wars between Athens and Sparta. The island of Melos was the only Greek city-state to retain its independence during the conflict, even though they had cultural ties to Sparta. The Athenian leadership was of the mind that you either had to be their ally or their enemy. They wrote to Melos demanding that they join the Athenian Empire. If they refused, the Athenians would destroy the city's defenses, kill all of the men, and sell the women and children into slavery. The Melians wrote back arguing that they were neutral, and more to the point that they posed no threat to Athens or anyone else. The Athenians countered that the Melians' independence made them look weak. The Melians then suggested that the gods would take revenge against the Athenians if they destroyed them. The Athenians responded, quote, "Right as the world goes is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must," unquote. On a moral level, this shows me just how far the Athenians had fallen. From a state that defended the Greek right to self-governance, Athens had become just another empire. That being said, this is one of the more accurate descriptions of power politics that I've ever heard, and it still rings true to this day. It's not rosy and it's not right, but it does seem to be the way the world works. Right or wrong, the Athenians were as strong as they said, and they would make good on their threats. They conquered Melos, they killed all of the men, and they enslaved the women and children. However, the Athenians would soon pay a heavy price for their aggression. Shortly after they destroyed Melos, the Athenians overreached. Alcibiades, their new charismatic leader, convinced the Athenian assembly to attack the city of Syracuse, all the way over in Sicily. So the Athenians have not finished their war with the Spartans, who are right at their doorstep, and now they're going to start another war with a power that's extremely far away, or at least very far away by ancient standards. Greek drama and mythology often center around tragic heroes. While many heroes often have admirable traits, they're often beset by tragic flaws that ultimately lead to their destruction. One of the most common of these is called hubris. Hubris, or arrogant pride, comes from thinking that you are greater than you actually are, and not acknowledging your limitations. The best example of this in Greek mythology is probably Icarus, ignoring his father's advice and flying too close to the sun. This same hubris was causing the Athenians to attempt ever more daring feats and to exert ever more tyrannical rule over their allies. The Athenians assembled one of the largest fleets ever seen in the ancient world, and thousands of soldiers. However, something very strange happened before the fleet was about to set sail. One night, all throughout the city, religious statues known as herms were defaced. People began to suggest that Alcibiades was responsible. And this is not something the Athenians took lightly. If you were guilty of committing a blasphemy like this, you might even get the death penalty. Alcibiades demanded an immediate trial, but the Athenians decided to send him to lead the expedition first. So the fleet set sail under a commander who was being accused of a capital crime. The fleet, under Alcibiades, made their way to Sicily, but shortly after arriving, a ship arrived from Athens, recalling Alcibiades to face trial back home. He decided instead to defect to the Spartans, offering them information as to how to defeat the Athenians. So the Athenians just launched a major military campaign very far from home, and right off the bat, their commander defects to the enemy. If you're thinking that's probably not a great start, you would be right. After a few initial successes, the Athenians were routed by Syracuse and the Spartans. They failed to capture Syracuse and had to retreat across Sicily before being defeated in the field. The Athenians surrendered en masse, and the survivors were enslaved. Thucydides writes, quote, "Their fleet, their army, everything was destroyed, and few out of many returned home," unquote. Athens' control of the sea was jeopardized, and the larger part of their military strength had been wasted in a futile effort. The Spartans began to turn Athens' empire against itself. Honestly, the surprising thing wasn't that the Athenians eventually lost, but that they lasted as long as they did after Sicily. The Spartans' final victory came in 405, where they destroyed the Athenian navy off the coast of what is now Turkey. The Athenians could no longer import the food they needed to survive, and under the threat of starvation, Athens surrendered to Sparta. Athens was forced to abandon its democratic government, and the Spartans destroyed the city's defenses, pulling down the city walls. Athens and its people would survive, but its empire was gone. In the aftermath of the war, a new government was established in Athens. The new government is known to history as the 30 Tyrants. Now, the tyrants routinely executed Athenians and confiscated their property, driving everybody else who was their enemy into exile. In this environment, there were a lot of people that got swept up in the executions because they had something that someone else wanted. One prominent Athenian who was considered a threat to the oligarchy was forced to take poison hemlock. Now, the tyranny only lasted a year, and yet it represented perhaps the lowest point for Athens. Its victories against Persia, its far-flung empire, and even its prized democracy were gone. Its people had turned upon themselves, victims of their own arrogant pride. And that is, I think, why I entitled this episode The Fall of Athens. The fall here, to me at least, isn't so much in the fact that Athens lost to Sparta, as the Athenians people lost their sense of right and wrong and their desire to hold on to their empire. In the lifetime of just one person, Athens had gone from the defender of Greek freedom and independence to a tyranny not much different from Sparta or Persia. The imperialism, the exploitation, and the destruction of neutral city-states shows me just how far the once great city had fallen. It was in the chaotic period of the decline and fall of Athens that the people began to pay increasing amounts of attention to an oddball who walked around the city asking people questions. He called himself a lover of wisdom, or a philosopher. He would offer an antidote to the Athenians' hubris in the form of self-knowledge. He would forever be remembered by the world, and his name was Socrates. This has been Chronicles of the Doomed. Thank you for listening.